Well, I'm going to give it one more minute, but as you're entering, if you'll just put in the chat what your role is, and that gives me an idea of who's here today. And then we're going to get started. I'm hi Kelly. I just have to say hey. I'm so glad to be here today. My name is Susan Thomas, and I am a consultant with Family Connections and really work with them in the areas of special education. I am retired from the public school system. I was a special education director, and I also taught special education for many, many years. I always tell people I was a wannabe because I started out in general ed and really fell in love with students. First of all, believe it or not, some students that were struggling with behavior, I just loved working with those students. And then reading was the other thing that I was so interested in. In fact, one year my principal told me that I had to teach more than reading because I was teaching third grade. And she said, there is more than reading during the school day. And so I realized then that, I had an interest in special education, and that's how I got into it. So today, is going to be the whirlwind. I prefer to call this the public service announcement for the day, because I'm going to give you a lot of resources. I'm going to quickly walk through the IEP process. But the most important thing is this presentation will be shared with you along with some other tools. And then you will have those to refer to. And of course, as you know, Family Connections is always available to help you in the journey with your child, or if you are working to help families as they navigate this very complex and difficult system. As long as I've been doing this, it's funny how I continue some things I'm working on right now, still looking back in that law and going, I never thought about it that way. So we're always learning and always getting better at what we do. And that's really important for us to think about. And so I'm going to see if I can get this going here. And we're going to talk here about understanding your child's IEP. And I will ask Megan, who with Family Connections, if there are questions in the chat, because right now I cannot see the chat, if you'll kind of keep an eye on that for me, and I will try to come back to them as time permits. So let's get going. You're here, you hopefully know all the many, many services that Family Connections offers for parents, their parent training. They are a wonderful resource for you, one of many, and we're very happy to have them there. They are our parent training center funded through the OSEP federal government, and also our parent training partner for the state. Today, I hope you'll understand the purpose of the IEP. You'll kind of understand those essential components. I'm going to really hone in on a couple that I think are crucial, and then really think about the quality indicators of a well-written IEP, and understand the documentation that we need to have. That's something I'm pretty big on, is having documentation so that we know what's happened. I used to have a mentor that said, if it's not documented, it never occurred. And so things we can look at. I like to start just thinking about the purpose is really to give that individualized instruction, that individual, specially designed instruction. It's also about us enabling students to really have access to the general curriculum, but also to make progress. It's not just about being in the seat, it's about learning. And so having that available for them. And then also, I got a little ahead of myself, but that progress that they need to be making, and we need to have ways to clearly measure that progress. So IEP includes a whole process that we think about. It's very complex. I think it's complex even for those of us who are trained. And if you're a new parent, just finding out you have a child that is going to need an IEP, or maybe this is your first year in school with one, it can be a little overwhelming. And the one thing I will always say is never be afraid to ask questions, because sometimes as school people, we do this so much and we forget that sometimes there are things that maybe you're not familiar with, and it's always okay to ask questions. We have a plan, and it's a written document that we come to consensus on. And in South Carolina, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. We've got a new plan. South Carolina has moved to a new system for their IEPs. I've been in it a lot, learning about it. There are some differences, and so that's something that I won't go into a lot of that today, but do be aware that if you've been used to another form, there are new forms now. Not all districts have completely switched over yet, but that is the plan for everybody to be in. And of course, most importantly, and I'm going to go back there, this is about the services that we provide and the implementation of those services. I always tell people, you can have a beautiful plan. If it's not implemented, then we haven't really fulfilled the requirements of the law. And so that's the most important thing, is looking at our implementation. So let's just talk briefly about the process. And I like to always go to the law. So when we make arrangements for an IEP meeting, it needs to be collaborative between parents, school personnel, agencies, and others who have knowledge and expertise. And so that's a lot of different people that come to the table. And the other requirement for the IEP is that it must result in that plan that guarantees the delivery of services that ensures the needs of the student are met. That's really important, all the needs. I heard somebody talking a couple of weeks ago about category-specific needs. It's not really about category. It's about those needs that result from the child's disability. And our students, we have to look at that child holistically to address all those needs. So when we talk about developing our plan, there's a process. We have the IEP team selection. And as a parent, you certainly can invite others who have knowledge and expertise to come to the table. We have parents who may choose to bring an advocate to help them navigate this system. Members of Family Connections will sometimes go. I've had people bring family friends. I've had people bring their pastor. You know, it's whoever has knowledge of that child that can support the family. And the law says knowledge and expertise about the child, but I kind of always have said, you know, if you're helping support a family, that is what's so important. And then we have to have input in the development. The team gives input, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Generally, I recommend a written draft. Easy to do now, so much easier than it used to be, so that we can have a chance to look at it, and then we can have the IEP meeting that gives us time to review the IEP. And then, just so you know, this is the new plan for South Carolina. It's called EDPlan SC. It is an electronic plan, just like we had in the old IEP system. It's just that things are arranged a little bit differently that you'll see as we kind of walk through today. And after you get your first printed form, you can certainly see it. And this just kind of is the beginning of what you'll see. I printed one out, not with any information really, but this is how it starts. And you get a paper plan. Be sure that if you have a draft and we're making changes during the meeting, that those changes get made in the system. That's really important. I was always one that said we would always have the system up and running during the meeting, make those changes right there so we were sure we captured them. So you're going to have a written plan, and then here's some of the requirements. This is what has to be in the IEP. You've got to have a present level of academic achievement and functional performance. You have to have goals. You have to know how progress is monitored and reported, both. How will the progress be monitored and how will it be reported? You must give a description of special education, related services and supplementary services as appropriate. Not all students have related services, not all students have supplementary services, but if we have an IEP, all students should have some type of special education service. We have to have an explanation of the extent the child will not be in the classroom. And then we have to make sure that we have included, which goes into those supplementary aids, accommodations, and modifications. And then, of course, we have to know the beginning dates and the frequency, location, and duration of the services. And this basically comes straight from the law. I've got the reference down at the bottom about what's in the IEP. And then, of course, for students at age 13, we're going to start that post-secondary transition process. I've always said, transition starts much earlier than 13, but at age 13, the IEP does look a little bit different. So, and then we talk about the provision of services. And I've already said that's the most important thing, is getting those services delivered. And for that, we just want to make sure we're all clear on who's doing what when. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, about how I think you fully capture that in the written document. So writing and developing an IEP includes many partners. We must follow that written IEP. The practices and things we put in place must be based on peer-reviewed research. Case law has been pretty clear that, we can't, as a parent, you can't say you have to use this methodology or that methodology, but the district has a responsibility to be using things that are based on peer-reviewed research. We have some guidelines for that, and it's really important that we know that what we're choosing is based on evidence for the population we're serving. We have to monitor the progress of students and provide those reports to parents, and we should be following those high leverage practices because those are based in the evidence of peer-reviewed research for delivery of instruction. So we should be using instructional strategies that have been designed for students with disabilities and tested. And we're so fortunate now to have so many more tools than when I was still working in the district, of high leverage practices and tools to help teachers get those practices. And some of the other work I do, that's one of the things I work on, is making sure teachers have those tools. So let's talk about getting ready for the meeting. So I love this quote: "Before anything else, preparation is the key to success." Alexander Graham Bell. Over the years, I've sat in a lot of long meetings, and the longer they get, sometimes the harder they get. And sometimes I've felt like that's because we didn't do a good job in preparing for it, and really thought about that a lot over the years. Those are things I think I could have done better, of making sure that we were prepping for meetings. I like to say there are 4 steps. You're going to plan the meeting, and then we're going to go ahead and start looking at data before we get to the meeting, because to prepare the draft, we need to do that. And we need everybody giving information. And then we want to engage all the team members to go ahead and start analyzing what data we have to provide input, whether that's parents, general ed teachers, the special ed teacher, related service providers, people that are working with the student. And that can be outside, if you're using outside therapists, if you've got a tutor that's tutoring your child. That's all information we want to gather. It's very important we kind of pull all of that together to look at it. And then, of course, we want to draft an IEP so that we can start putting all the pieces together. And I feel like if we do a good job on that on the prep side, we're going to be a lot more successful when we get in that meeting, because we're ready. We're all ready, and we're all there with equal information. So when we plan the meeting, let's talk about that. There are a couple of things that a few things we have to have. So we've got to make sure we've got a schedule and that you've got notice, and then how we select members. So when we start talking about scheduling the meeting, we want to make sure that you're notified early enough to ensure that you have an opportunity to attend. There are no timelines for how in the law, but let's just face it, we're all busy. And so we want to make sure that we've given adequate time to make sure that everybody can get there as needed. That's really important. Sorry, don't know why that came up. And then The meeting must be scheduled at a mutually agreed on time and place. So I talk about this all the time. It's not just sending out, hey, we're having the meeting. Mutually agreed upon means we come to an understanding. So when I work and train teachers, I always say, hey, let's go ahead and get this organized before we send out any kind of notice. Let's talk to parents and see when they're available. Let's look at our schedules. Boy, doesn't technology make that easy now? You know, we can do a doodle poll even to see when people are available, so that we can make sure that we've got the right people at the table. It's really important as we move forward and plan for the meeting. So who's on the team? If you look here, I have a kind of little IEP team tip sheet, and I won't open this because it never works when I try to go off of my slide to the website. But the Progress Center, that is a national technical assistance center funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, has these awesome tip sheets. And so I've embedded these in the presentation, and this gives you a nice description of team members. They're like 2-page documents. I love them. So when you get this presentation, you can go take a look at it. It gives you some rich information. Here's the basic, what we know we have to have. So nothing used to make me madder than to go in a meeting and somebody say, well, yeah, I just got told I had to be here today, because we're supposed to all have something to contribute to the meeting. And so this is a little picture of the role and kind of the expertise that each person brings to the table. And certainly this is not exhaustive, but it is does talk about what we need to remember we want these people to do. Certainly parents and students. Students have to be invited at age 13. I personally think it's extremely important that students be there. I'm a big believer in student-led IEP meetings. They're powerful, but that's where we have information. That's the best information that we have about the child. Parents know their children. You know them in a different way than we see them at school. We may see them in a different way, but that you know them. You know all the other services the child's getting. And guess what? The child knows a lot. The student, I should say, because some of them are young adults, they know. They know what works. They know what doesn't work. Never seen a student that couldn't provide rich, valuable information about what's working. Your local education administrator is the person that can commit resources. Sometimes that's the building level administration, principal, assistant principal. Sometimes it might be somebody from a district office, but they have to be able to commit the resources to put the plan in place and ensure that it's going to happen. The special educator brings that knowledge of disabilities, knowledge about the student, because hopefully they've worked with the student. If it's a new student, maybe not, but they certainly understand a lot about those students. And then the general educator brings that knowledge of the general curriculum, what the expectations are, because special educators are not all trained. I mean, you don't want me talking about, what's expected in Algebra 1, because I don't know. And so they bring that knowledge, but then they also have rich data on how students are responding in the classroom to accommodations and modifications. They can contribute when we're talking about behavior, about things that work and don't work. I personally think when we empower general educators in meetings, we have much better results in the classroom. And so making sure that they feel a part of it and that their knowledge and expertise is valued on the team. We have to have an individual who can interpret any data from evaluations. Sometimes that's a school psychologist, but it may be somebody else on the team. Trained special educators certainly have this training. Teachers have this training, and administrators, many of them do. And so they have to be able to make sure that if we're looking at current evaluations, we understand them. And then related and supplementary service providers, they provide guidance on services as needed. And then agency representatives. And that's, we sometimes use outside services. I think most of the time I think of first is vocational rehabilitation, for students when we're starting to look at that transition. And so, but certainly anyone who's providing those services from an outside agency, a lot of times we may be using a mental health provider from our Department of Mental Health. We might be using somebody from the Department of Disabilities and Special Needs. Anybody who's working with that child can certainly be invited to the meeting. And then, of course, anyone with knowledge and expertise. I always say it's just nice as a parent, if you're planning on bringing somebody, let the school know that you're planning on bringing somebody. It's just nice. It's kind of like we don't, if companies showed up at our door and then we didn't know they were bringing somebody with them, it sometimes puts people, they're not at ease. And we want people to be able to really work together. So if you're planning to bring an advocate, or if you're planning to bring someone else as a support person, do let the school know you're planning to do that. Team members can be excused from the meeting, but there are a couple of things, and I will say I do think EDPlan does a much better job of addressing this, our new system. If the district and parent agree in writing, this is straight from the law, that the attendance of the member is not necessary because you're not going to talk about their area, any allocation of resources, or that member's area, the curriculum or related service is not being modified, you can certainly, do not have to attend the meeting. They can be excused. And we want to be, judicious in the use of people's time. So sometimes we may be having a meeting where we're making a few changes, but not changing everything. And so we're going to have the key players there. And then you can also excuse people if we're making changes to the area. So suppose we need to change occupational therapy services or something like that, or maybe we're increasing the hours for special education services. We can certainly excuse people, but we once again have to have consent in writing for the excusal. And the team member must submit in writing to the parent and team input for the development of IEP before the meeting. And so I think it's important in the new Ed plan, there's actually a place where you check if the member is going to be excused, and it actually then sends you to where you have to fill out the reason for the excuse. And so that's a big improvement, because I do know people were excusing people without getting that in writing. So as a parent, you do have to sign that. We have to have a written notification. That's one of them we have to have. So before the meeting, suggest items for the agenda to the team so that data can be collected prior to the meeting. If there are things you want discussed, let them know. That's part of your input. I'm going to talk a little bit more about input. And if the meeting is virtual, make sure you prepare ahead of time. There's a virtual training tip sheet. When I work with teachers, I talk about virtual manners, that we all have our cameras on, that we're all there and, attending. It's very easy to get distracted virtually sometimes. And I do believe there are times when it's okay to request that you want the meeting in person. Was on just a meeting, not IEP meeting, not too long ago. We've been meeting virtually and decided we needed to start meeting face-to-face to have some more rich discussion. So certainly that's appropriate sometimes. And then the next step, we got the meeting ready, we're set, we got an agenda, is we want to look at all the data we have prior to the meeting. And so that we can develop good present levels of performance that are current, so that we can address the needs of the student. Data that we should have in the present level, first of all, we want it to have the strengths of the student. These enable the student to progress in the general curriculum. I always say this is a part that makes choosing where students are going to spend time easy, because we want to put them where their strengths are first. That's a no-brainer. And then we can talk about, okay, what will they need if they need support? And also, this is how we build a strengths-based IEP. So we're looking at what the student can do instead of what the student can't do. And so we're using what they can do to kind of help build that IEP. Of course, we've got to address the personal weaknesses of the student that they demonstrate, where they demonstrate a need for additional support. That's really important. That needs section, that's the basis of what we do. And then we have to give a description of the student, how the student's disability impacts their educational performance. And of course, that's directly related to their needs. And their needs don't stay the same from year to year. And, the example I give a lot is I may have a young student who comes in with a specific learning disability, and reading is their major problem when they are initially placed. But as they get older, we've gotten accommodations, they've improved their reading, but they still have a processing issue, because that's what learning disabilities are. And so their services may look different. Their needs are different. A lot of times we see in older students executive functioning, those types of things. So it's really important for us to think about that as we develop the IEP, and remember that present level with the needs is what drives a statement. And then, of course, we're going to have data for progress monitoring to establish that baseline for the goal. The present level must contain data that has baseline information for the establishment of the goal. So that's the data that has to be present to build. If you see present levels with just descriptors and no numbers, I'm always like, we need to get a little bit better here, because that's how it's fine to have some descriptors, but we really want to have those things that are measurable and observable. And I always like to talk about that data, that we have multiple sources of data. We have norm reference data. That data compares students to each other. So when we have MAP data, we have iReady, even our SC Ready is a comparison. So how is that student doing compared to their peers? And to me, this is one of the most important pieces of information, because it really supports the need for special education. It's very important that we look at that. And then diagnostic data. The diagnostic data helps us determine the areas that we need to how we design specially designed instruction. I always say diagnostic data tells me what I need to teach. And then we want to have progress monitoring data. We want to have the baseline, because it informs the effectiveness of instruction and the student's response to instruction. That's the big key piece of good progress monitoring data. Not only does it tell how the student responds, but it also lets the teacher know, has their instruction been effective, and what changes that might need to be made. So there are a lot of data sources: assessment results, rating scales, grades. I always say grades are the least reliable, because there's too many. Maybe you've never had this experience of somebody that takes off points because a child didn't put their name on their paper. All those kinds of things. Progress monitoring data, direct observation, and then, of course, you may have student interview data, parent interview data, all those things. This is not an exhaustive list. But what I do have in your toolbox is this is data for consideration that we might see in the different domain areas. In 2020, there was a whole Teaching for Exceptional Children's journal that was dedicated to IEP development. Dr. Mitch Yell from the University of South Carolina was one of the lead authors on many of the articles in there, and along with David Bateman, both two experts in the field. I love to go to anything they're doing about special education still. And so this is was adapted from their tools, but I put things that I knew some of them are, I know we use in South Carolina, or know they're popular in South Carolina. So this is just a tool so you can kind of see okay, where might we be getting data from for each of the domain areas? And of course, the parent and student input. So I always say we want parents to let us know about the academic and functional strengths, needs, any kind of private reports you have, any kind of medical updates, any kind of observations from home. The form has a place for parent input. I prefer that, do a summary there. I prefer to see that embedded as evidence in the strengths and needs section as a member of the team. So it's not an afterthought, and input should be provided beforehand. We should never be asking a parent right before the meeting, hey, do you have anything you want to say? That shouldn't be happening. We want to get that rich data because what's happening at home is very important. And, I always like to give just a simple example of this. I may be, as a teacher, giving reading at home and or some assignment at home, and it's a nightmare for you and your family every night. Well, that's important for us to know because we may need to modify that assignment. We don't know, we're not there. And so I think it's really important that we capture all that information so that we can have this joined effort to provide for students. This is just a sample of a parent input guide, and I have that in the folder that kind of will some questions. I know a lot of teachers send home an interview form. Some teachers call and ask, just do a verbal kind of interview. Some parents are okay with writing, but that's something I would say ask a teacher of, how will I give input into IEP development? What will work for you? What will work for both of us? And then come to some consensus about that. And then, of course, involving students is really important as well. My students have always given me the best information. That doesn't help me at all. And, it's been on the IEP for 5 years and they're not using it. It doesn't help them. Kids can give us so much information. And then we want to engage team members to really take all this data and analyze it, which means we're going to use kind of a problem-solving process to think about, what are the real needs, and then what kind of outcomes do we want to have? What kind of goals do we want to develop? How are we going to get there? And what will the services look like? That's crucial when we develop this. It's we've got to have all of those pieces in place. Parents and students should provide input about suggested accommodations and modifications, goals for consideration, and services. So it's not just the school giving that. Parents can give that input too. And one of the things I think is really important when we think about goal development, particularly for students that have more extensive support needs, we need to be thinking about outside the school day. What are things that are going to make that student more independent? What are those goals? Sometimes I think we forget those. We're so focused on our standards and our academic standards, and we forget about some of those goals that are necessary. So giving input on that. Remember, it's a team decision, so input doesn't automatically mean that everything goes on there, but that means that we should consider it as a team. And then we have that development of the IEP. So we've kind of done all that. We've looked at all the current data from the PLAF, and now we're ready to take that data. We've thought about, kind of brainstorm, hey, this is what I want. And we're ready now to really talk about how we develop the IEP. I just have this to talk about the process. We usually talk about the standards being in the middle. And remember, that's the academic standards. We know that we have to serve those functional needs so that students can access the standards. So we start with assessment. We, do that present level. We talk about the accommodations. We get into setting our services for special education. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I always like to talk least intrusive to most intrusive. We get that specially designed instruction, and then we progress monitor, and then we're back again to the cycle. And so it is a continuous cycle of how we serve students. A little bit about what you should see in a good present level. You should see the strengths, the needs, the evidence of impact, baseline of goals, and evidence for goals and services. I always say the needs should connect to goals and services. So if you see down here at the bottom, I've got a little tip sheet for you. Another one of those short 2-pagers that has great information on what a good present level should have. These are required, but also we want to make sure they're well written. So in EDPlan now, we've been calling it as I said, the PLAPA, forever. And now it's called the present level of performance section. And in that section, it's different because you will see parental input. There's a section for that. And then they have actually separated out academic and function. So there's a section that walks through academic domains, and then another section that does functional domains. And in each section, this is what they ask. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about this. But the order on the form says strengths, and then what's the impact? Does this impact the child's education? And then they list priority needs, and then there's a goal section. When I've already done a training on just not writing an ed plan, but just thinking about how do we make sure our process, that our function is guiding, not the form. We always want to develop our needs and go over those before we determine impact. That's because the needs drive the impact statement. And so just because it's not in that order doesn't, like when the teacher sees it, it's not in that order when you see it on the IEP. But we always want to think it's strengths, needs, and then what's the impact. And then we would determine whether we can meet it through, supplementary aids and services, or do we need special education services and related services? And, of course, this special ed is always, it all depends on the student. But just a little bit about that, and I'm not going into that a lot today, and that might be something we can look at later. This is what you see on EDPlan now for the parental input. It will say, and I just did took a screenshot, summarize parent input concerning, and I had a student strengths, weaknesses, interests, and goals in relation to educational needs. So you can put those summary statements there, and they should be there. And then we can also embed those in other places, the information that we have as well. And then this is just a screenshot of what I was talking about with the order. This is what you see from a printed IEP and EDPlan. The domain you can see is academic achievement, strengths. This is the strengths and abilities part. And then the next part says, how does IDA's exceptionality does affect involvement and progress in the general curriculum? And then it asks you to identify how. And then they go to the priority need. And so I suggest IEP teams that we always talk about needs first, because that's the guide. I can have a disability and not need special education. And so the needs are what drive the impact and their progress in the general curriculum. I'm not going to read all these just for the sake of time, because I got to get through this, but these are in your folder. These are some guiding questions. And I call these quick checks that when you're looking, you can actually go in and say, hey, is this here? So when I think about academic and functional strengths, does it compare it to peers? Do I know how my child is performing compared to what we know the peers are? It's like when I get my blood pressure taken at the doctor, they have an average blood pressure it's funny. I just turned 65, and now it's for someone your age, the average is, which I'm not sure I like that, but that's kind of interesting because we want to have that rich comparison data. It's really important. So that's just a quick text section for this part. When you do your impact statement, it must clearly define and outline the student's need for special education and the involvement, participation, and progress in the general curriculum. It's kind of sets up as a quick and down and dirty. It sets it up for what am I going to now see? Why do I see all these other things in the IEP? And then remember that present levels always lead to services.
Dr.
So once,
Thomas,
yes.
Sorry, can I interrupt you for just a moment? There was a clarification that I wanted to ask. The section about impact, and impact meaning whatever modification is being done is working. So clarifying that impact statement.
So the impact statement just means the best way I know to describe it in this way is that why does the child need to have special education services? So it should define the need for those services. Does that make sense?
Thanks. If not, put it in the chat.
Sure, and I can clarify further. It's not meant to be, talk about effectiveness of, prior services or anything like that. It's just, based on the needs in the present level, this is why the child needs special education.
Thank you.
So, for my pretend IEP that I've written, my child had significant reading issues. Some of you that know me won't be surprised by that. And of course, that reading impacts their ability to access grade level content material. And so that you would see something like that.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
And there was one more that was just a question about the parent input and whether or not that's the teacher's responsibility for summarizing, or if parent specific verbiage, language concerns are included as is in that.
I think that that is kind of a team decision. I don't think there's anything in the law that says, about that, about summarizing or how it has to be written. In fact, the written plan doesn't really call for that, that you have to have that, but the development of the IEP when you read the law. And so what I would say is if you're not okay with the way it's been summarized, certainly you need to bring that up. And if you've been given a draft, bring it up before the meeting so we can clarify it. Some people are good at summarizing, some people aren't. And also something you may think is important, and I may look and go, it's not really important, I'm not gonna put it in there. So make sure that you bring it up in the meeting. I hope that answers that question. All right, I'm gonna get through here. I got to keep going. I've already talked about this, but this is straight from the law. What does the IDEA say? Services have to be based on peer review research. We give them so they can advance, so that students can advance appropriately towards attaining annual goals. So they can be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum and other extracurricular and non-academic activities. So remember, these services don't just cover the school day or don't just cover academic content. And so that they can be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and non-disabled students. And remember, a lot of people want to get this confused. It's not general classroom, it's general curriculum. So we have some students that may need services and they're being taught in a different setting. Least intrusive to most intrusive. Always start out talking about, can we meet that child's need through accommodations, supplementary services, modifications to the general curriculum. Those are the two. We start with accommodations and supplementary services, and I'll go through these. But remember, supplementary services are done on behalf of the child. That might be something as simple as for a student with visual impairments that we're providing Braille for them, and we have a Brailleist who prepares the material. Modifications are how do we modify the general curriculum? What can we do so that that child can participate? And then we go to specially designed instruction. We may have all those things. We may decide, hey, we can meet this child's need through accommodation, so we're not going to need a goal for this. So that's why I said always start with this, because we want the child to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And so that's really crucial to think about. So that's that next part of the IEP very quickly. In EDPlan, they call it accommodations, modifications, and supplementary services. In the law, it's defined as supplementary aids and services, which includes accommodations and modifications. And then those services, there's a great tip sheet on it for you there. Remember that our strengths enable us to select the general education environments for success. If I know a student likes something, they've got an interest and preference in that area, they're strong in it, they're going to be more successful. We all are. And then we want to select those accommodations and modifications that they're going to enable them to use their strengths. My favorite example is if you have a child who has poor listening comprehension skills, that's not a strength. Having things read aloud is not going to help them. So I've seen that on a gazillion IEPs. So we may have to think of something else. So that's why I say always use that strength to make those decisions. Barry said this, got a little ahead of myself, I always do. Remember that these services are provided in Gen Ed and other education related settings. That means non-academic areas, lunch, recess, after school clubs, possibly in after school care, all of these places so that students can participate. If it's open to all students, students have to have these services to be a part of it. It's not just for that academic, it's the whole school experience. When we talk about accommodations, we think about that's a change in how the student accesses and demonstrates learning. This is what allows students to show what they know. It increases our participation, but it doesn't change what they have to know. And so there typically are 4 different types of accommodations: setting accommodations, environment, where that might be as preferential seating close to the teacher, preferential seating, the student is sitting away from the air conditioner, whatever that is. Presentation, that usually has to do with our design or delivery of instruction, how students respond, and then when we schedule. And so it's really important for us to think about all of those pieces of information. When we're thinking about accommodations, nothing drives me crazier than to see an accommodation that's been on something for 6 years that nobody even knows really what it means. And I've been in meetings where I've seen that happen. But we want to look every time we are developing an IEP, what does the student use? I mean, what helps them? What's the perception? I mean, are they willing to use it? Is there something, if they're not, let's talk about what they are willing to use. And have there been difficulties in administering the accommodations? Accommodations have to be, doable for a teacher. And we have to think about what's the most efficient way that we can get the students' needs met. Modifications change what the student is expected to learn or demonstrate. And we can't deny access into a classroom just because the student can't do all the standards. But we have to figure out what it is together, general ed, special ed, parent, all involved, about what those modifications might be. Because students can benefit and learn. Maybe they're not going to be able to earn a credit in high school, but they are going to be able to benefit from being in that classroom. And so, I think this is something we've made a lot of advancements in. I think we do better with it. I think we have so much more technology to help us with this. But let's make sure that we're maximizing modifications so that students can be educated. It doesn't mean we all have to know the same things. Guess what? No student in any classroom knows and learns the same things. We have standards that guide what we teach. Students are at all different kinds of levels. Remember, general educators really provide a lot of input about what are those key critical skills when we're selecting modifications. They know what are those most important things. I'm not a content area specialist, so we've got to rely on those content level specialists. A couple of things to consider is we want to make sure that the student's present level indicates a need to narrow the breadth and depth of information. And then we want to know about general perceptions of that student. But remember, the child also has to gain educational benefit from being there. They're not there just to be with their non-disabled peers. They're there to learn. And if they're not learning, then that's not an effective modification. Remember that in the services section, you'll be talking about direct and indirect services. This is how we get into the goal is, remember, to maximize the ability of the student to learn alongside their peers. Don't forget extracurricular activities. And also, this is where you put training. So that's a supplementary aid section. Just very quickly, in EDPlan, there's a drop-down box, but I want to be very clear, and I put an arrow here. It says custom accommodation, because if it's not in the drop-down box, it can be added. So don't let anybody tell you, well, this was what was in our drop-down box, because you can put any kind of accommodation that you need. You know, it's limitless what we can do with accommodation. All right, once we've determined that support, then we're going to start thinking about those goals. And remember, measurable goals must be developed for all areas needing special education or related service if that's appropriate, as documented in the IEP. And the goals should be based on the skills the student needs to access and progress in the general curriculum. Some students will have objectives. Those who are taking alternate assessment must have objectives, and I don't have enough time to go into all that. I will tell you, goals have to contain the condition. They have to target a behavior. They have to have criteria for mastery, and they must be obtainable in a 12-month period of time. Got a nice little handy dandy goals tip sheet here. I've got a few examples. I'm not going to read aloud because of time, but here's some where I've outlined condition, observable behavior, and measurable criteria. Remember, observable behavior means I can see and count it. So anytime you're thinking about that, that's a good way to think about it. Here's an example with objectives. In EDPlan now, teachers actually have a script in there to put the goal in. It'll say the student's name. It really outlines those major portions of the IEP for goals, for writing goals. So I'm hoping that's going to help us with making sure we have good goals. Always remember, quickly, condition tells under what circumstances. The observable behavior is that targeted skill, and then how will we know? The measurable criteria, those three parts. Testing, won't spend forever on this, got to do it. I do have a nice assessment tip sheet that kind of explains state testing. Here's my big thing, because this changes from, year to year, how we look at things. But the law does require us to put accommodations for any assessment measures that we're using on state and district-wide assessments. And so, that's straight from the law. Something I always like to say, two important things. Not all things we choose for instruction are allowable on testing, but we should never deny a child instructional accommodations because of a one-day test. So if you hear them say, well, they can't do that in testing, so we're not going to allow it, that's not a good reason. But you have to understand as a parent that they may not be allowable for testing. So we want the, I always say I want the 364 days, that 189 days for that child to benefit, or 179 days of school, rather than that one of the 180 that they're going to be taking a test. So have that discussion. Just remember that. And then also remember, if you've got a student who's going to college, just because there was an accommodation on the IEP does not mean you can have it on the ACT or SAT. You have to send those off testing that you have to do that as well. The other big reminder, students have to be taught to use the accommodation, as do teachers who are implementing any kind of particularly assistive technology. That training should go into the supplementary services section, and the accommodation must be implemented during classroom instruction, and we really want to keep data on effectiveness. Remember that our students with our most significant modifications will take alternate assessment, and that's a whole different thing. We don't have time to go into all that today. It's very complex, but if you do have a child and this is your first experience, do talk with your teacher about that. And then we have specially designed instruction. And I just want to talk, I know I'm running out of time. Special education means specially designed instruction. So if they're not giving specially designed instruction, you're not getting special education. And the law says that is adapting content, methodology, and/or delivery of instruction. This is a great tip sheet that defines specially designed instruction. But if they're just doing the same old thing that everybody else is getting, that is not specially designed instruction. We want to always consider how much time it's going to make sure that goal is reached with that specially designed instruction, and then what kind of services, direct or indirect. And this is what you'll see on EDPlan. Reading instruction. You can see the beginning date, the ending date, the frequency, delivery method, and the location. Then there's a description part at the bottom. That should be the most powerful part. Everybody should be able to read that and pick it up and do it. If I get a new IEP for a student I don't know, I should know exactly what I'm going to be doing, what will be provided. That's important. For students who need related services, this is a nice tip sheet, but remember, related services are so the child can benefit from special education. And that's always the question. Do we have occupational therapy because they need it to benefit from special education? And that will always be the question that the team has to ask. This is a list of related services, certainly not everything. It could be that the law says that list is not exhaustive. Remember, related services in the law do not include any medical device that is surgically implanted, or the optimization of a device's functioning, like mapping or maintenance of that device or the replacement of the device. And some related services have minutes, some don't. So transportation has minutes. Sometimes, there's some services that there are no minutes for. Team needs to be determined that. If there's a goal, there needs to be minutes. This is what you see on the related service part. This is just from EDPlan. Just quickly, you can see the name of the service, the begin date, the end date, frequency, the delivery method, and the location. And once again, there's a descriptive part on this as well. Direct services are provided directly to the students. And I always say direct services always will have minutes. Indirect services are not instructional and they're designed to benefit the student. There should be documentation of those services. And you can have kids that have both, direct and indirect. And just remember, there should always be a well-written description of those services. And then finally, talking about progress monitoring, make sure that you know exactly how progress will be monitored and the schedule. My advice to teachers is always have your data collection sheet right there. Let parents know, this is how I'm going to be collecting data on this goal. This is how I'm going to collect that data and report the progress. So that's very clear. Briefly extended school year. Just remember, IEP teams make those decisions. You should never hear things like your child isn't eligible for extended school year. because the IEP team makes the decision. You make it prior to the end of the school year. To make that determination, a lot of times you can defer that decision. You can do this with an amendment like the ESY section in EDPlan. It does talk about the major things that eligibility, the concern about regression, the students at a critical point of instruction, the nature and severity of the disability. Won't spend forever on this because we've got, I know I've done a training just on extended school year, Megan, and so that's one that we can bring up when it gets a little bit closer again. And finally, when we talk about placement, and that's our LRE section. EDPlan calls it placement. This is what it looks like. This is what you'll see. So it automatically calculates when you put in the services for the team, exactly, the percent that they're not removed and where they'll be. So percent not removed, 80, placement inside regular class 40 through 79% of the day. So that's an interesting thing. This is not a complete IEP, so don't go by these numbers because it was not completed. And then there's a section in the plan where it says participation in general ed, and actually the teacher sees a checkbox and she checks all the things, or he checks all the things where the child will participate, and they will put, the teacher will put all those different things. And then there's another section that says removal from programs, why? And that's also a list that's been populated. And they say things like, and one I checked was direct specialized instruction for some learning activities. There's a lot of choices there. And but you can also add other things just to let you know that is new in EDPlan, the way that's set up. There's some things that are gone from, that were enriched, that I'm glad are gone because they're not required. And then there is a section that says, was there a significant change in services? In other words, have you gone from, less or more than 50% of the day? And then for students who are 5, there's a question about that. It populates where you put the continuum of placement. This is not new. These are the possibilities of placement, the school of residence, a non-resident school, an alternative school. I won't read the whole list. And then the last thing that IEP should do, which is actually at the front of the IEP, is the considerations. And the law doesn't actually require this to be as part of the written plan. It's included in the development that you have to consider whether the behavior impedes the student's learning or the learning of others. For our multi-language learners, their language needs, if there's a visual impairment, communication needs, and assistive technology needs. I always say do the considerations part at the end because it's a good checklist to say, yes, behavior did impede, and we've got services for that. We've got supplementary services. We've got special ed services. There's how we've got a goal, all those things. And so it's a great checklist at the end. I'm not sure why we have it at the beginning, because there's actually a thing that says to describe the services, and we haven't even gone over the services yet. And so I always like to come back to that at the end. And then our state now has some additional considerations they've added. The healthcare plan, the individual language acquisition plan for students, for our multi-language learners. And then there's actually a consideration for special needs for transportation. And that connects to the, our preparing for transportation. So those are on there. They're under considerations, but they really do help us reference other services. Not going to talk about post-secondary transition because we'll do a whole nother section on that. And then not going to go through behavior intervention planning because that is a whole nother thing. But remember, when a child's behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, we have to consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and support. And I'm sure there's going to be behavior training. Remember, signatures, law doesn't require them. It's not an agreement. You're basically signing that you were there. And one of the things that we always wanted to know is that you understood the IEP process. You should always get a copy of the IEP. And remember, prior written notice has to be given before the IEP can be implemented. So you have to have time to receive it before implementation of the IEP. I always tell people, don't put the IEP is going to start the next day if you can't get the prior written notice to the parent. I did it and I went over 6 minutes. I'm sorry. I tried. What can I do? It's Megan, I'm sorry.
I think it's a new record though. Just a lot of great content and we could spend an entire day and still not be done getting through everything. So I just there were a couple of questions that we kind of addressed along the way, just to let everyone know that yes, you are getting a copy of the PowerPoint, the link, so you can look through. We will be posting a recording of this on our YouTube channel. In the meantime, if you have questions, one-on-one specific that you want to talk through about your student or students maybe that you're working with, you can call our support and information line to 1-800-578-8750. So leaving you all with a lot of information, you know all how to find us. If and when you have follow-up questions, I am going to ask that you give us some feedback. I've put the link in our to our evaluation. Appreciate your feedback and suggestions for future trainings. So, and I saw that there was a question about upcoming trainings. Yes, so if you go to our website, familyconnectionsc.org, on our training calendar, we've got upcoming trainings. You can look and see what's coming up, click the links, register those, and you can always email us at that trainings email if you can't find it or you need some additional information. So thank you, Susan, for being on. And I guess that concludes today's session.
Thanks. Happy school year, everyone.